She's published widely and well on topics in city migration, inequality, poverty, several monographs and edited volumes over the years, sprinkled in nice articles in European Sociological Review and the likes. Besides doing research, it's fair to say you do an enormous amount of service to our fields, like co-investigator, understanding society, serving on the panel of the IFS detailed review today. So here, some try to move about conflict-related migration using the case study of Russian invasion in Ukraine. Well, yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's really nice to be able to present this work. It's very much work in progress. So I'm keen to hear your responses, suggestions, and feedback. So this is joint work with Timothy Brick from Kiev School of Economics. So in fact, I knew Timothy. I first met Timothy when he was a PhD student at Carlos III in Madrid. When we first started talking about this project, he was already at KSE. That was in March 2022. But he was since rather rapidly promoted to being rector. So he's been quite busy over the past little while. So, but it's been a good partnership, and I'm hoping we'll be able to potentially do more and build on this in the future. So I'll say a little bit more about about that partnership, about the data. I'll first acknowledge the very generous support from the LSE, from their RIF funds for this work, from their kind of time sensitive call, which was the first example of a project funded that is shaped around it. And also grateful to Gradus who fielded the survey under sometimes difficult circumstances, including, for example, the timing of the third wave of the panel I'm going to tell you about was affected by the fact that they really had no capacity now, staffing capacity because of the situation in Ukraine. So really appreciate them and the quality of what they fielded and the impact they delivered to us. Okay, so let's give a bit of context first. So there's a lot of conflict-related migration, and just to give some examples, UNHCR estimates that at the end of 2022 there were over 108 million forcibly displaced worldwide, and around 63 million of these were internally displaced. That was by the end of 2022. If we think about in the very recent past, what we've been seeing in Sudan, by February 2024, there have been 6.14 million internally displaced since April 2023. It's an incredible scale of displacement in a very short time period. And then another nearly 2 million involved in cross-border movements. Though not all of these cross-border movements were Sudanese nationals, foreign nationals returning, which just highlights some of the complexity of the patterns of displacement we see when the situation arises. Another longer-standing conflict, which has resulted in a migration, is Syria, where it's estimated to account for 1 in 5 refugees globally. 6.5 million hosted in 131 countries, and another nearly 7 million internally displaced. This was by late 22 before Sudan, as it went the numbers stakes. And then Ukraine. So there are various estimates for Ukraine, but at September 23, there was an estimated 3.7 million internally displaced. A further 4.5 million had moved and returned. So this also indicates the scale of returning, which we often don't think about in relation to necessarily to internal displacement, and how to understand those movements, and also how to categorize such people. And then internationally, we've got estimates that of 5.9 million refugees internationally displaced from Ukraine from the UNHCR. And of course, within countries, there's many more than actually internally displaced who are in need of humanitarian assistance of some sort. So again, estimates from IOM is that there's 17 million people within Ukraine in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. So a lot more than those who are internally displaced, even if the circumstances of those who are internally displaced are more extreme than those who are not. So there's a lot to think about there. There's a lot to think about the situation of international movements, of internal movements, of moving and returning, the kind of fluidity of these movements, cross-border movements that depend on sort of prior connections, and the situation of those who don't move but still maybe in challenging circumstances. And I'm toning in a bit on the subject of the talk today, a bit on in Ukraine. So there's been various characterizations of it as that the refugee flow has been the largest and fastest movement of refugees since the end of World War II. So that's one claim that's been made about it. And that there's been massive amount of movement, even if there's been also quite a lot of return. That's part of what's captured there, even if the numbers of sort of people you count at any one point in time are not necessarily the largest relevant. And what we see for internally displaced is that there are key areas where people moved away from, specifically the eastern regions, since February 24, 2022. But in other regions, these are the oblasts, there's some overlap. So there are people moving to and from the same places. For example, people leaving Kiev city, and other people moving to Kiev city for the opportunities. And so you've got internal dense displacements that are in both directions within other areas. So again, it's that complicates the story and is part of the complexity of the situation. Stepping back, thinking a bit about what we kind of know about conflict-related migration in general. This is a very abbreviated and sort of partial review, but trying to pull out some of the main themes for the purposes of contextualizing the talk. Okay, so that we know that there's extensive migration. I've just showed you that. So in conflict settings, we also know that the majority of displacement tends to be internal rather than international. And of course, we also know that the majority, in most cases, typically don't move. A lot of our understanding of conflict-related migration is derived from studies of those who do move, and particularly from refugees. So there's a wealth of literature on refugees, on their characteristics, where they come from. But of course, this doesn't necessarily capture how they are similar or different to internally displaced, or how they're similar. Some of it captures in broad terms how they're similar or different to those who don't move, but often again in broad terms. But this is a huge literature. It's also quite a geographically specific literature in terms of an awful lot of it. An awful lot of the academic literature is concentrated on Europe, even though, of course, that's not where most refugees actually are. And that raises the questions of the extent to which this European literature actually extends and is applicable elsewhere. We can think about, so there's what is it that distinguishes people who do move in these situations? So the actual movement of people has been associated with having resources, having networks, the extent of actual exposure to violence or threat, and some of the literature suggests that it's those who are not exposed who actually move more. And there's probably something going on around relation to that, but again, it's specific studies. Prior experience of migration is often associated with movement, even in a conflict situation. So what we think about as a force movement is also very dependent on these things that shape migration generally, resources, networks, prior to migration, and prior migration intentions as well. And then, of course, as well as direct risks and constraints on movement. It's just not possible. And we'll come back to that in the Ukrainian context as well. So there are these factors that have been examined, and some seem to be quite well supported as being associated with conflict-related migration, but particularly for refugees, the situation for IDPs is a bit more complicated. And there is some indication that there's variation across different contexts in the relative importance of these factors and the extent to which they do help to drive migration. There's also a big literature on, big and growing, I would say, literature on return and how we think about return. I think refugees and internally displaced typically plan to return, but those plans can be kind of never fulfilled or fulfilled over different durations of time, or can be seen as being sort of aspirations more than plans as well. There are different, and again, there are different perspectives on what actually drives return. But there's, it has been suggested that sort of the hostility of, there are push and pull factors. So the hostility of the kind of post context can drive return migration, as well as circumstances in the home context. But there's some recent research on Syrian refugees in Jordan that suggests that actually host country conditions only play a minor part, and what really matters. It may seem intuitive, but you know this is something which hasn't been shown so much before. What really matters is the conditions in the home country, whether it's seen as being plausible, safe, realistic to return. And then accompanying this is questions about how appropriate kind of a policy focus on facilitating return actually is, and some of the ethics around that. And this is relating to the refugees, thinking about the concept of return among internally displaced is anyway more complicated. So it's because refugees across borders, we can think about going back across the borders. But internally displaced, they've moved to a different part of the same country. Are they still internally displaced 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later? There's current work. Some here were told about ongoing in Sudan, where it's trying to classify people from earlier conflicts and say so who are also internally displaced as internally displaced since April of last year, and then there's internally displaced since 2014. And does it make sense to kind of aggregate all these, or are they conceptually different? So there's also some questions we asked about our terms and how I think of these that again are interesting, but make things a little bit more complicated. Okay, so if I wanted to summarize the key questions and debates in the literature, they are often around who moves and why. So the characteristics of migrants and the motivations, what facilitates the moves of the migrants themselves or of others, in terms of things like resources, features of the context, networks, and so on. That can support the move. What drives migration intentions and return migration plans in the first place? And then this key question of how do people adapt over time? So people are saying they wanted to return, but in fact, how are they adapting and how are they reconceiving of their situation over time as conflicts endure or as they change forms, they play out. So we've got a lot of, this is all areas that are covered by a lot of research, but the answers are not always consistent. And it's been argued that we need to extend some of these research questions to less studied contexts, and that there may well be differences once you do that. So harking back to this issue about, a lot of the research on refugees is focused on Europe. So there's been research looking at attitudes to Syrian refugees in Jordan, of course, a neighbouring country where there's a lot of what I call cultural similarity, and how does that shape what we think we know about responses from host countries to migrants, where there's this proximity and similarity, and how does that mean we perhaps need to rethink some of the European literature that states as kind of general propositions how refugees are responding to in Europe. And again, the ability to sort of now compare with Ukraine has made that question much more. There's been lots more potential to start answering that question. I should have said I'm quite happy if you want to ask any questions and clarification as I go through. Though I'm quite glad I'm not picking as many as Alexander got last week. So what do we know? So turning from these general questions to the context of Ukraine again, turning back to Ukraine, what do we know about Ukraine and conflict migration so far? Well, when I started this project in March 2022, very little was the answer. Now the answer is quite a lot. There's been a lot of research, not all of it currently in publishing journals, but quite a lot of reports, so there's an expanding literature. It's addressing a range of questions. So there's numerous studies now on refugees, the refugee experience, and Poland has been sort of a prime site for that, because it's the recipient of the largest number of refugees. So there's been work on all sorts of areas, resilience, migration trajectories, and the role of civil society example. A lot of qualitative work about with refugees themselves, but also work that depends on register data and large-scale surveys. So this is quite an interesting paper which tries to track not only the movements of people, but also their use of services, the use of things like education and social security and representation and employment. There's a distinctive feature which has also shaped what we know about and what's been researched about Ukrainian refugees is that their flows have been dominated by women, and often women with children. This is partly as a direct result of the fact that martial law imposed in Ukraine constrains the movement of men. But means that it's quite distinctive compared to other refugee flows that have been analysed in Europe. So that has shaped the sorts of research that's been undertaken. So quite a lot more perhaps studies than you might have expected from past literature, looking at schooling and child welfare. And there's also research on children's education as a reason for return, a reason for recrossing the border to ensure children's education. To state the obvious, unlike other refugee flows reaching Europe, Ukraine borders the European destinations where the refugees end up. So this makes it distinctive from much of the existing US and UK literature on refugees and flows and integration that's based on long distance moves, and perhaps makes it potentially more similar to those studies which have looked at sort of more proximal movements. Movements of Syrians to Jordan, for example. And this gives them some potential for rethinking, reworking how we analyse refugee flows. And that has been taken some advantage of. And what we've seen as a result of that is also there's been a lot of information about the sort of fluidity of the movement. So it's become very immediately apparent because of that proximity, because of the movement, the fact that people are moving to destinations that we're border with, how much there is to movement to and fro. And also the network nature. So people moving to places where they may have already been to, where they have connections, friends, family, and so on. And there's various studies on that. And what I think was quite a striking finding was that from the Biegert and others article from 2023, is that they recorded, using their registered data, they recorded that there had been around 8 million Ukrainians entering Poland in the year after 24th of February. But they're currently an estimated 1 million there. So that's kind of just that scale of those movements is very striking. And again, it makes it sort of interesting to study, but also complex to study. Who are we actually talking about? How are we talking about? Do we need to set some time parameters on this? Are there links to that? Despite the proximity and the network connections and the sort of prior experience of migration for some, there was research which demonstrates that economic and social integration does remain a challenge. And it remains a challenge as it does more generally for refugees relative to other migrants. So the big literature of refugees always tells us that refugees fare worse than other forms of migrants in terms of economic integration, partly because of policies, partly because of their characteristics and the fact that they weren't necessarily intending to move or not intending to move exactly then. And this is what we see, it seems to be true also for these Ukrainian refugees. And despite the sort of policy, a lot of quite facilitating policies in terms of actually moving into countries. And as we mentioned, those in Ukraine, so internally displaced in Ukraine, face a very dire economic situation. So there's economic challenges. So given we know so much already, what can I add? Well, what can we add? So what we have is we have quite a lot of detail from early in the period on moves, motivations, and networks. So we collected data starting in April 2022. So we visited, as I say, we prepared this in March. We were trying to think what were the interesting questions at that point, looking ahead. And what we've got is a short panel. So we've got 3 periods where we link the individuals across 3 periods. And I think this is what makes the data unique. So it's thinking about how we can make the best use of that. So we can see how individuals' circumstances evolve, but also how some of their attitudes and orientations evolve. So we can look at that adaptation question in relation to this panel, short panel. The main focus is on those within Ukraine, both those who did move and those who didn't move, and they get the same questions, and so we can compare them. That was sort of by construction, because although we were interested in international moves, in the data, as you'll see, there weren't actually that many in our sample who did make international moves. So I've hinted at the nature of the data. I'll tell you a bit more about that. What we have is a nationally representative survey of 1,000 respondents, aged 18 to 60, from a bigger Gradus-run panel, online panel, who were first interviewed in April 2022, and who were then followed up in August 22 and January 2023. So the existing sample is, I said it's actually representative, it's actually based on large collaborations, but it's broadly expected to be representative of the population as a whole. And with weighting can be adjusted to be reasonably representative of the panel as a whole. The timing was intended to capture early and then phased follow-ups. So in March 2022, we didn't know how long we had. If you can remember back to that time, there was a lot of uncertainty. So we initially thought, well, we'd get into the field fast, and then we probably have 2 follow-ups at 2 or 3 month intervals. As you can say, the intervals aren't quite that, but this was partly due to capacity constraints, as I've indicated, both capacity constraints of the new rector of KFC, and also capacity constraints from Grants itself in terms of being able to have a developed staff to implement the survey. And so there's no particular logic around these periods, but they still give us different phases in people's expectations. And what I haven't done, but what I can do, is to sort of link more to the timeline of the conflict and see exactly what was happening at these points to contextualize that. That's to come. So we have, as well as the follow-up of the individuals, because there's attrition. So we have refreshment. So we have 1,000 people interviewed each wave, with new people added to replace those who don't respond. I'll show you exact patterns, but for example, wave 1 to wave 2, 700 people who responded in wave 1 responded in wave 2. So then we had a refreshment sample of 300. So we can analyse it as sort of repeat cross section as well as the longitudinal sample. And we designed a questionnaire of 30 to 40 questions, which we tested early in April, and then we did it a bit later in April. Via kind of a mobile phone app for these people who were already part of the Grants panel. And it was pretty much the same. We made minor modifications to wave 2, which were then retained in wave 3. And we also had, because the existing panel, we had information on some basic characteristics, and also on information that preceded the invasion, on their financial situation and on their oblast, so where they had been before February 24th, which we can use to sort of characterize the sample. So that's the data. To say a little bit more about the survey design, so we put together the survey. Our expectation when we did this was that we would capture some people who moved, and we would, in later waves, we would capture more people who moved, and we would also capture some returns. So we designed it trying to build that in to our expectations and think about that in terms of the sorts of questions about currently where they lived and where they moved to. We wanted to implement it as early as possible, because we wanted to get the early response to conflict. And also, as I mentioned, because we didn't know how long we were going to have, whether it was going to carry on for. We were not looking to capture sort of experience about the conflict in terms of trauma, or the direct observations on the conflict, but more to capture rationales for moving, staying, resources, and sort of dynamics of moving and who with, and so on, those sorts of questions. And we wanted to make sure we were asking questions about orientations and decision making prospectively, so that we could see how those played out. And we were particularly interested in the role of the networks in line with a lot of the literature. We're interested in the role of networks in moving and choices of where to move to. And that's what we hope to get. So you can see the extent to which we actually were able to follow through on all of these issues. So I'll just illustrate when I talk about findings, I'll just illustrate the sample and the sample retention. So we have 1,600 people in total. 400, around 1,600, 432 of these responded at each of the 3 waves. And then another 268, then us to 700 were waves 1 and 2, but not 3. Another 41 returned in wave 3, even though they hadn't responded in wave 2. And then half of the, or more than half, slightly more than half of the wave 2 refreshment sample also responded in wave 3. And then we have some who responded only in 1 wave. And by construction, the whole of the refreshment sample could only respond 1 wave in wave 3. So I think that's particularly given the circumstances which this one had taken, I think that's a kind of reasonable level of follow-up. But the attrition was less than I'd initially feared when first opening the wave 2 data. If you look at the characteristics of the sample, you can see across the waves, there's a bit of variation across the waves, and I've also given you the weighted proportions as well as the unweighted. The main difference is that the weighting makes is to it downweights the actual levels of those with higher qualifications, and it downweights also the proportion of females. So we know that women are more likely to respond to surveys, and this is true with these data. This is true basically with all data. But the weighting price reduced for that. So there's a little bit of variation in terms of the samples across the waves as a result of the refreshment samples. But you can also see some of the movement pattern here as well. So I've just put down sort of those who stayed, portions actually still who are planning to move. And also those who are uncertain. Yes.
Thank you. I want to ask, why do you use weight? Is it to make the survey representative of the whole country, or?
Yes. Yes. So that's the idea. So and we can see where the sample is kind of not. It also shows where the country is basically not representative as the weights make it statements. So it's just to illustrate what that is. And why we might not want to use weights. So yes, what's coming through a lot is kind of just the simple uncertainty. So we ask, for those who hadn't moved, or those who had returned and therefore counted as not having moved in the second and third sweep, we asked them whether they were planning to move, and a lot were just simply uncertain. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of the responses, that we're just kind of not knowing.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious. I mean, I don't know. I have a hunch, but it's not. I don't know if it's the right one. I'm trying to figure out. I mean, some of these, it's clear how you figured out the weights, right? But how do you figure out the weights for questions that probably only your data would have the answer to, like the questions about moving inside and outside returners and whatnot?
So these are weights that come with the data.
Oh, okay.
So they give based on so they give a weight to the respondent, and then that weights. So for example, if people with high qualifications are less likely to be more likely to be uncertain, then adjusting for that will then downweight the number of people who can be said uncertain.
That makes sense.
I'll move on anyway, because I was noticing the time. I spent rather longer than this than I thought. Just one more illustration of the sample, just so you have a hang on. It is looking just at wave 1 characteristics or pre-wave 1 ones. So this is wave 1, and then this is the sample who responded to wave 3, and seeing how much the longitudinal sample differs from what we started with. So how much the attrition has been selective. And well, it's a matter of interpretation, but it doesn't look like it's hugely selective. Which is nice for the analysis and encouraging. Okay, so I've looked at the data. I've also done some analysis, some preliminary analysis. So the 3 areas I'm going to work now is just thinking about the patterns of early movement and the predictors of early movement, patterns of movement and the predictors of early movement. Some comparison between stayers and movers, focusing particularly on the wave 1 And they're looking at this issue of adaptation. So looking across all three waves in relation to their attitudes, but also economic circumstances. So what people are experiencing in terms of economic circumstances, given the situation is quite dire, quite extreme. So those are the three areas I'm going to look at in different ways. So the first one, just a simple illustration of the different possible patterns of movement. So people could stay continuously, and they're the biggest chunk of our sample. So 60% of our sample of people who were sort of continuously in this place where they had been before the 24th of February 2022. And then the next biggest category is those who've already moved by April and who were still moved by way through. And then there's various other combinations. Oh, and the third one, yes, so these two are very similar, is those who had moved it and then they went straight back, which is sort of consistent with all this information about there's a lot of churn and a lot of return in this context at the time, even in.
A quick question, are these weighted or are these unweighted?
These are weighted.
It seems to be just.
No, they're not, they're unweighted.
It's just
Yes,
the-
no, they're just the numbers and difference, yes. Yeah.
Just a quick clarification, I'm a bit confused.
Yeah.
So can you explain to us how does someone return and stay? Or how they return, moved? So that means they're moving, they return to their home, then they moved, and then they moved a second time?
So I'm now it's slightly simplified. So there aren't very many who've returned by, but of the ones who returned once they returned, they then didn't move again.
Okay, well, any of the repeated ones, how about the ones moved, return? So they moved twice, so they're.
No, so they just stayed moved.
It's a status.
So it would be possible to break it down into those who moved to a different place.
Right, so
But
stay refers to their home.
So it's exactly, stay refers to the place where they were before the 24th of February.
I see.
And so yes, so these people are probably, they could well be, they stayed moved. Yeah, thank you for asking, that's a good point of clarification.
As opposed to repeated movement.
Yes, I mean, they will encompass some repeated moves, but they simply aren't the numbers to do that, to informatively do that breakdown. Yeah. Okay, so then there's this question of what drives movement, and as I say, there's quite a lot of literature in this, which suggests one of the things that matters is resources. So this is just looking at that, and also, as I said, we know about the Ukrainian migration among the refugees. There was this dominance of women, so looking at sex, looking at age, looking at financial circumstances, and then crucially also looking at the region.
So in this analysis now, what does move mean? Does it also mean return?
So this is early moves. So this is looking at just the wave one.
Yeah, but there can be people who return in wave
No,
one.
no, the returners are not counted as.
So only if you're, basically those who are not in their home place in wave one are movers in this. And those are still or return to their home place
Yes.
or, otherwise.
And I checked by looking at the kind of city they're in, that's fixed, yes. So what you've seen is perhaps unsurprisingly, the biggest predictor of movement is the region they came from. And specifically, if you look at the oblasts, there's two oblasts which contribute to that movement. So it is very much, geographically driven. So you've got, so the east is where it's done, and then also, but you can also see some of the variation within the country. That the reference category here is Kiev, the region, and you can see that there's less movement from central and west and southern compared to Kiev, but more from the northern. So there's some geographical factors in place. And once you take account of that, there's not much else. So there's not so much else going on. There's women are more likely to move. So it's applying also the combined international and international routes. So it applies also to internal displacement of women with more consistent with what we might expect. I mean, it's not a very good measure of financial circumstances, but there's no evidence that financial circumstances being better off facilitates move from these data once you've taken that into account.
Does the survey have a question about children? I can't remember that.
Yeah, it does have a question about children, but it's about children who are living in with you now.
Okay.
But there's also questions about whether children we've moved with. Yes.
And
So,
that's obviously not in this model, or
So
there.
this is looking only at pre 2020, pre-February 2022 characteristics. So it's looking at kind of what we know about them from before the war broke out. And we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have a measure of children from there.
Okay.
So that's why I didn't put that in, because it's kind of, it's hard to separate out, but it's a good point. The family circumstances is likely to make a difference as well. Well, yeah.
Out of curiosity, is there a question about language, like is the first language Russian versus Ukrainian? Because I was just curious if that might be a predictor of weight as well.
Yes. I know it could be undertaken in Ukrainian or Russian. So I don't think I have that information in my data, it should be there somewhere. Anyway, so the takeaway from the thing is I'm trying to test with this issue around financial, whether it's supportive of the literature that says those will be better resourced. We can't say we can't say that it's just not significant, but certainly it doesn't tell us that there is a resource effect driving that. We've also got, and then this is just giving a bit more illustration on those early movements that we're predicting here, and just some descriptions that again speak to some of these arguments in the literature. So whether people are moving with others or on their own, so only 13% of those who moved have moved on their own. Timothy was very keen that we collect information on pets. He said Ukrainians are very keen on their pets. We need to know whether they moved with them and also whether we left them behind. So 24% have moved with them and 17% have left pets behind. And we can also see who they left behind. So not very many have left a spouse behind of these movers, but a larger share have left parents behind. And then thinking about what they gave as their main reason for where they went to, that the dominant reason was that they knew people there. This is very much fits with the arguments that elsewhere. This is, as I said, it's dominated by internal displacements, but it fits with the arguments made about international displacement. The networks are kind of key for our understanding of where people live. And then they were asked how long they play there, and around half were uncertain. And even these are weighted, I'm not weighted. So there's this high level of uncertainty, which is probably not a surprise, but I think it's also worth you emphasize that actually people just don't know what they're going to do with you. You expect people to have plans and intentions, and they don't. And then just comparing, what's the differences between those who move and those who don't move, in terms largely of most economic circumstances and their attitudes. So they kind of do these distinguish them. And you've got the significance test in the third column. So you can see that unsurprisingly, those who moved were less likely to be in paid work. Those who moved were less likely to have enough to live on. And once they moved, the only other one that's sort of marginally significant is the hopefulness. So you can see that those who moved were less optimistic. Which again is something we don't really know, because sometimes there's a sort of this expectation that those who move will have kind of, they will be thinking more positively about the future, but there's also a literature which suggests that migrants as a whole are kind of more pessimistic. So there's some little bit of insight there. That's the first, that's the second question I was going to show you, and I'm just on to the final one now, which is looking at this question of adaptation. So if you change our descriptive data here, I estimated both per models and then separated, then distinguishing some of them by sex and by whether they were movers, and allowing infraction, so you can see whether the movers differed in terms of their levels of adaptation. So as I mentioned, we know that there's quite a lot of information on these sort of extreme economic circumstances that people, both those who are not internally displaced, but particularly those who are internally displaced experience. But here we can see there's been an increase in those actually in paid work across this period. So things may have been, and that applies to stayers as well as to movers. So things may have been pretty bad in April, but they do seem to be getting into paid work increasingly across the panel. And this is using the whole panel, so it's using the whole 3,000 cases. I just did a sort of sense check to check that we got similar results if restricted to the smaller ones who were just there in all three waves, and we get a very similar pattern, which is as you'd expect, but also really. So I'm just going to use a whole panel for the remaining models, remaining estimates. So this is whether they were facing, whether they said they had not enough to live on. So they were asked whether they had enough to live on but not for long, or enough to live on. And so the most extreme response was not enough to live on. So the model all three responses, this is these responses, not enough to live on. And you can see again, there's a sort of, generally speaking, there's an improvement. It's a downward slope. So things getting a little bit easier, a little bit better. When we turn to attitude, so we get a slightly different picture. So this is asking them about whether they were very or fairly hopeful about the future. And you can see that there is quite a substantial decline. All of them, women tend to be always lower than men, sometimes significantly so, sometimes not, in terms of their hopefulness, in terms of their not just the economic situation, but also their hopefulness. And you can see that it looks like for movers, it looks like there's been some recovery, but it's not kind of statistically significant. But generally, you've got this sort of leveling out effect, but a drop. So generally speaking, people are less hopeful. And when we think back to sort of March, April, there was a lot of people making very positive nationalistic statements at that time. So you can perhaps think that this is hard to sustain over a year, or over a period of time, less than a year of time. This is also quite stark. They were asked about whether their children expected their children to have a better future than them, and these are the proportion. Is that a hand up? Oh, sorry. Sorry, Mark.
Yes, sorry. So I think you said at the beginning that the dates of the data collection.
Yeah, I've got it wrong. Yeah, no, that's right. Yes.
No,
yes.
That's what you said earlier. But can you map this with development in the conflict as well?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I haven't done yet. That's the next step.
Okay.
Yes. No, it's a good. I think it's very important that I try and do that. It's just quite a lot of excavation to do.
It also maps like outside of conflict kind of mood change. January, right after Christmas. You know, what it makes them more hopeful for some reason.
Yes. Yeah. So they're not.
Well, not you know. Yeah.
And it was late January, so it was probably quite. Yeah. So I don't know when is Ukrainian Christmas. I don't know when it is actually. It's a different date, isn't it?
They changed it.
Oh, they changed it, didn't they? Yes.
Yes, Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, just to clarify again, what the group now, so now, because now we don't see any returners, so the returners are stayers now?
So this is, the terms of stayers, yes.
Yeah, so every stayers are people living at home, right, and movers
Yes.
are people living somewhere else.
Yes, yes. Quite funny to agree with you, exactly, yes. Yes. Yes, because the returners always say they will stay. If you look at their what's going on there. So people who said in wave 2 that they were stayers include people who said in wave 1 that they moved, and if you look at the place, you see that actually it's because they moved.
Right. So let's say January 2023, female movers could include women who have moved in April 2022, who have moved in August 2023, or in January 2023. And stayed in the first, and stayed and moved. But
So yes, because it's a time it's a time varying, so it's whatever was, so in the data, it's whatever they classified as at that point.
yeah.
So they're currently classified as having moved, yes, yeah. So they might, so they include people who've been, but we can't do that in breakdown for this one. So because the moved is effectively the internally displaced. You like think of it like that. So what I'm interested in is internally displaced versus not internally displaced. So perhaps I should rephrase it to that, if that makes it easier. That's what it's capturing.
And it wasn't about the complication, it was more about just because earlier there was the option of returners, now they're not here, so I just wanted to clarify in which.
Yes, yeah,
Which category.
yes. Yeah, so I think, so this is just the probability of saying very or fairly likely, so it's based on, I use the whole range of data, but then I'm just combining the responses in the estimates. Yeah, but they're not not very hopeful, or they're decreasingly very hopeful. So going down to only 50%. Sure, they can have a better life than them, which is quite a strong statement, I think. And then this is they're asked if their best years are ahead or behind them. So again, modelling the whole range of responses, but then just picking out those who said the predictions of those saying their best years are ahead of them. And again, they're less likely to think that the best years are ahead of them over time. And they were asked a similar question, which is my final slide. They were asked a similar question about whether Ukraine's best years were ahead of them or not. And you can see a bit of recovery for the stayers, but generally still a downward trend. So again, back at the early period, around well in the 60% thought that Ukraine's best years were ahead of them as a country, and now this has declined quite substantially over time. So they're thinking they're less years. Okay, so I'll go to the conclusions. So what I hope I've done is shed some light on short-term transitions, experience, and attitudes of Ukrainians, both those who moved and those who did not, in this year or less than a year after the invasion of Ukraine. So trying to, as I say, with the aim, trying to capture the immediate aftermath and how people are situated, and particularly how they're situated in wave 1, less than 2 months after the invasion, and then what happens after that. I think the main driver of moves appears to be the original location, which is consistent with other findings. But there are also moves coming from other places. So there are moves both away from and into Kiev, as well as returns there. So other than these main oblasts where people move from, there's a lot of movement where a destination can also be an origin. Simply noted that finite resources don't appear to be salient in moves, but networks do seem to be important. And those who move have greater chances of being financially insecure. And if we look over time, it improves both for those who moved and those who stayed. And that the optimism declined across periods. So the only final thing I want to do is, as part of the funding application for this, there was a certain amount around proposed dissemination. So here I've started the dissemination, well, I've already done a little bit of dissemination, very early dissemination, with the way we've done one later, but this is the main next step. But also we proposed doing a podcast or doing a it's originally going to be one recording, and it's now expanded into a kind of a 5-series podcast called Migration, Conflict and Crisis, where I'm going to be talking to researchers who've worked on migration and conflict. Really interesting. So do look out for that.